Hey everyone, welcome back to the Spector Creative channel where we like to answer questions about the toy industry and why it works the way it does. Now I got a request from Carl Kuras who asked about reboots and how they work. I'm obviously not talking about the CGI animated show from the 1990s. I'm talking about when a vintage property gets a new version. And he asked me a video on what makes a good reboot versus a bad reboot. And how do you know a reboot is even going to work, or is it even a good idea? Well, obviously this happens all the time, where a property that did well 30 years ago gets a new version. And over time, those versions tend to, well, I guess, repeat and feel like you're just kind of getting the same story over and over again every 15 years. And that's pretty much what a reboot is. It's bringing back IP that had once worked and bringing it to a new generation. Now, this can work and it cannot work. There have been reboots of the same property within a short amount of time, and while sometimes they remind you of the original, a reboot can also be a disaster. All right, so how do you know when to hit the reboot button? When is it time to bring back an old property, and why do companies even doing this? The big reason is because it's a safe bet. Because a property with an existing fan base is much easier to put product out with versus something brand new and original, like Secret Saturdays is a great example. I was at Mattel when we were making toys of this because it seemed like the next big thing, and it bombed hideously. So yes, taking a risk on an unproven property is tough, which is why companies kind of have rules of what works and what doesn't, and really looking at the difference between generations. Because not every product line and every IP is going to work with every generation. I mean, look at the generation today, with their kind of woke attitudes, and we're seeing corporate America feel the wrath of this. I mean, look at that last She-Ra reboot that was on Netflix. That was definitely a product of the current generation, and it had very little appeal because the current generation, well, they're not exactly into timeless brands because every generation wants their own thing. Yes, there are timeless things like the Beatles and Elvis and the Bible and Sherlock Holmes, but properties like He-Man, created in the 1980s, were a product of their time. The idea that He-Man is timeless, yeah, he will be for those of us who grew up with it, but that's because during that time, during the 80s, it was all about big muscles. Starting over and trying to take a brand that worked for a specific generation, you can either continue the story that your parents were watching, or you can start over. Now, this is something that was done with Star Wars with Lucasfilm, where they wanted to continue the story that the previous generation grew up with. Well, again, much like issues that corporate America is having with making different changes, part of this got rid of all of the existing sequel content for Star Wars. And other companies have done this too. DC with their New 52, Destiny 2 tossing away all the old story content. So if you are continuing a story or starting over with a reboot, you have to be considerate about the brand identity and your already existing fan base. Are you going to alienate them by starting over, by saying that all of this previous content doesn't count? I mean, old school content is what keeps the fans, and telling us that this content basically just doesn't count anymore, that there's going to be a constant new version, well, that's a rough pill to swallow for a lot of fans, because we kind of want to preserve our memories and the way we cherish these products. Now, the other big thing about a reboot is ensuring it's going to translate into toys, what we call toyetic properties. Now, this is probably the single most important factor when considering a reboot, is can you take that IP and turn it into merchandisable toys? So let's look at He-Man again. The CGI show that was on Netflix is a great example, because while there was another He-Man show for more adults, this one, which was aimed at the kids, was a perfect reboot. Unfortunately, it didn't work because of the generational issue, but as far as the product and the content, wow, I mean, it just checked off all the boxes. All of the characters had light-up features or sort of different modes where different colors were used to indicate what kind of power they were using. Like, He-Man could be all powered up in yellow there on the top right, or standard on the top left. And different characters evolved. So, Ram-Am became Rampage and, went from originally pink to that green. And all the characters had their own symbols, their own icons, kind of like, DC does that with Flash, Green Lantern, Batman, etc. Symbols are very important. They translate well to t-shirts and merchandise, And one thing that this show did very well as far as a reboot was it checked off all those toyetic aspects. Symbols, armor, light-up features. It had everything it needed, and because they were going with a reboot, they could bake these toyetic concepts into the content. So like having Skeletor in the content have a glowing green arm, that works so well as a toy. So that's why this show worked so well as a reboot, but unfortunately, the nostalgia aspect kind of lacked because, well, kids had no idea who this character is. And basically, where do they begin? One of the ways you can kind of mitigate this risk is by having the original content available when the reboot comes out. I think this is incredibly important. One of the problems, though, is most companies, well, they value their brands more than their people, honestly. I mean, I've seen so many mass layoffs at large toy companies I've worked for simply because the brands are viewed as more important than the workers. And that's why you see constant reboots of these brands, because it's less of a risk than trying to create something new. And, well, people are replaceable, brands are not. And so you can bring in a new brand manager to, handle any major IP. Creating new IP, however, and IP that's a much bigger investment. And unfortunately, in today's modern a-go-go world, we tend to have sort of, I call it, too many suits and not enough Geppettos working on, these new toy lines. And people who are, just looking at the bottom line and saying, okay, safe bet, reboot, existing fan base, go. But unfortunately, because people get reassigned and brand managers, creatives constantly, well, there tends to lack a vision, someone who's going to think about the long-term, call it thinking fourth dimensionally about the IP and the long-term consequences of a reboot. I hope this answered your questions about what goes into doing a reboot and when toy companies should and maybe shouldn't reboot old properties. The best way to support this channel is always to share these videos with others, and thank you so much for that. All right, I'll see you guys in the next video.